People often ask me if I have any regrets as a YouTuber. What's your least favorite video, or the video you wish you could retract or redo now that you know more about the world and YouTube? To be quite honest, I'm sure I've made a few doozies in my 3-year career on YouTube, but once you start making roundabout one video a month, the older ones start receding into memory. There is, however, one video that still sticks in my craw a bit. As soon as I hit the publish button, I knew something was seriously wrong with it, and even 1 year down the line, I didn't really feel like I gave a good treatment of the topic, at least not good enough for very many people who saw the video and had additional questions. And the video I'm referring to is Why I Don't Vote, a rather meandering freeform meditation on why I didn't think voting was a particularly useful political act, and how oftentimes it's overpraised for really superficial reasons. Now, looking back on it 1 year later, I think the main problem with the video was that I was taking too much of a personal, snarky point of view. I wanted to give my own story about why I, as a blue state American, don't vote, and how voting generally possesses what economists would say is a negative or near-negative opportunity cost, aka your time can almost always be done doing something more productive, even something politically more productive. But altogether, this perspective I don't think really got to the heart of what people wanted to hear about in a video on voting, and that was my general opinions on democracy and the political act of voting in the abstract, especially as it pertained to choosing a government and wielding power through that government. I remember reading two general sorts of complaints under the video titled Why I Don't Vote. The first was a very understandable counter-argument against the position I was putting forward involving the negative opportunity value of voting. A vote is power, isn't it? Even though it's a very small amount of power, if you're given a small amount of power, you still take it, right? And this counter-argument appeared right next to another very justified dissatisfaction with the video, and that is that the video didn't go far enough at really addressing the arguments for and against democracy. After all, democracy is one of the most prominent buzzwords of the Enlightenment. It's the sine qua non of the entire American system, at least from what we learned in primary school. And I think a lot of people thought that this initial video explaining why I didn't vote was a more or less snarky way to dismiss a very serious school of thought that puts ultimate political importance on the act of voting and the act of participating in what we call a democracy. And looking back on the video 1 year later, I feel this disappointment acutely, especially after I have begun engaging with a lot of people on LeftTube. After all, I've just finished making 2 videos, adding up to almost 3 hours of content on the word capitalism, and how I don't really believe it means very much or really reflects a real idea that I think leftists genuinely oppose. Instead of constantly addressing buzzwords and non-concepts, shouldn't I go to the heart of what left-wingers actually have as a value? And if so, wouldn't one of those central values be democracy? They constantly talk about that, don't they? And after all, it's my rather outspoken skepticism towards democracy, and not my relative indifference to the notion of capitalism, that really sets me aside as a counter-progressive politically. So why don't I present a more thoroughgoing critique of democracy itself? Well, point taken. But that being said, where do I even begin? How do I start critiquing a concept that most people consider to be unassailable in the modern world? The notion of democracy. Now, before I begin, a lot of people who watched my previous videos on capitalism did suggest a place to start in the critique of democracy, and that was to do a video explaining why democracy was a magical word. And I see the motivations for this. Democracy is a huge buzzword, especially on the left or progressive side of things. Anything that's good is democratic, and anything that's bad is anti-democratic. I mean, the word's a favorite of every hack politician that wants to invade a country to spread democracy. And I can see how, under these circumstances, the sort of tautological nature of democracy, its association with good and evil, and its use as a political buzzword, democracy seems very much like a magic word by my previously given definitions. It has social consequences. But that being said, I don't think democracy really is a magical word, for the rather plain and boring reason that it's not particularly vague. I know what democracy is. It translates very easily. Democracy is voting. Democracy is speaking as a collective to make laws and choose leaders. I can point to democracy, I can see its evidence, I can do a democracy. The concept's not vague, and it even translates well. Sure, people get kind of upset when I tell them I'm against democracy, but it's more or less the same way they get upset when I tell them that I don't vote. The emotion and the energy is more or less the same thing, and I've replaced an abstract concept with a very particular action. So, by the translation test, if nothing else, democracy is not a very good fit for a magical word. But that being said, the concept is a buzzword. And in my opinion, people do tend to overvalue it. They tend to attribute to democracy mystical properties that I don't think are in evidence historically or even in our contemporary world. And because of that, you get to some really weird situations, especially when the left side of the political spectrum tends to be voted against, like in the case of Trump or Brexit. Although, due to the Electoral College, the left has an easy out with Trump. In many ways, I do believe that the overuse of the buzzword democracy is a trap, but to borrow a quote from Dune, the first step to evading a trap is to understand how it works and to be aware of its existence. I think when analyzing or critiquing democracy, a lot of right-wingers begin on the wrong end of things. They tend to provide examples of when democracy didn't work or backfired on its intended benefactors. Worse yet, a lot of right-wingers try to ambush progressives by definitions about what democracy really means. Did you know that we don't live in a democracy, we live in a representative republic? Did you know that Aristotle considered the word democracy to represent the degradation of polity, the same way that tyranny was a degradation of monarchy? Really, all of these digressions aren't very illuminating to the point at hand. Definitions and language change over time. We all know what progressives mean when they say they support democracy. We should also understand that progressives know that democracy has had its share of failures. They understand it isn't perfect. But when looking to understand the limitations of democracy, we also need to understand what's so attractive and why progressives and leftists consider it a central value. So once more, where do we begin? Well, although I have discussed the variety of ways you might take on a very hard question like this in other videos, see insert here, I think the best way we can really ask questions about democracy is to try to break it down, analyze it at a very intimate level, by creating simple models that reflect our intuitive notions about how democracy should work. We can see where some of the failings are, and then see how those failings are subsequently confronted or exacerbated as the model becomes more complicated. If we were to examine these models of democracy, given what we know about human nature, given what we know about how human societies function, what would our conclusions about a system of democracy be? What would we understand about how democracy operates? We as modern people all have a vague feeling about why democracy should work in practice. So let's start with a simple example, an example that we've all experienced. Let's leave aside all of the complicating issues about interest groups, about sacrifice, about scarce resources and expertise knowledge. Let's just examine a small group of people trying to divide up a single resource that no one had to work for. Say, for instance, to take a local example, 3 people trying to determine which restaurant they should go to get a free meal. Say, for instance, that every day the company they work for provides them with a free meal, given that they can all decide on one type of food. However, each person having different preferences, some consensus needs to be agreed on. In this scenario, I think 2 systems immediately suggest themselves. The first system is to have one person make the decision finally for the group. In absence of an absolute consensus, we might assume that there is one person who's particularly qualified in terms of intelligence or in terms of empathy to make the decision on the part of the group. And we might consider this option to be something more or less akin to a meritocratically inspired monarchy. However, I think the more immediately apparent system of dealing with this problem is to let everyone make one choice about the meal they would like to have, and then let the majority rule. This gives us an impression of fairness, the idea that since everyone's preference is equal, and no one person is more an expert on another person's preference than they themselves, it makes sense for everyone to put their say in, so that the most people in the group get their first choice of what to eat. Leaving aside any complicating real-world factors such as work and sacrifice, at least if we take the perspective at this level, democracy has two naturally appealing elements. There's a utilitarian dimension where the most people are served, e.g. the voting majority, and there's also a notion of fairness and participation, a sense that the people whose interests are involved are making the decision that governs those interests, which I think is a very fundamental idea of human self-ownership that you will see in a lot of different societies, not least of which were the European societies that we have historically termed the West. But even in this very simple example, where once more I have removed most of the external pressures, most of the internal pressures any political system would have to contend with, we can immediately see problems. We can immediately think of ways where the majority rules will not necessarily be the best way of making the decision. Take one instance I think we've all experienced, where there's a minority with special needs, a minority with asymmetrical needs. To continue with the food analogy, say for instance that one of the members, after pizza is voted the majority favorite, cannot eat gluten. They have a celiac digestive disorder, and voting for a pizza meal, while it might satisfy the majority, will leave them hungry. They won't be able to consume anything. In this case, the downside of a pizza vote asymmetrically impacts them, even though they are the minority. Of course, in the small toy example I've listed here, there almost always is a very simple solution to this problem. And that solution is to employ good old-fashioned empathy. Sure enough, if we know one person in the party can't eat at a particular food establishment, and it more or less comes down to our preference, we'll change that preference momentarily to suit them. Their general sustenance is more important than our preference. But with the inclusion of empathic decisions in the democratic process, we've opened up another flaw that we need to confront, and that is people lying. Now that exterior facts about people's needs come into the equation, and not simply a poll on preferences, people can manipulate other people's votes by pretending to have some kind of asymmetric, discrete need that needs to be taken into consideration in the vote by other people who wouldn't ordinarily vote their way. Thus, a person could pretend to have a food allergy or a religious dietary restriction in order to move the democratic vote to something that they just preferred, taking advantage of other people's empathy in the process. Of course, at small levels, this problem has a very obvious solution. Lying is hard among people you know. Eventually, the web of lies catches up to you, and if you're working in a small peer group, it's not very advantageous to keep on lying. Someone will know the truth and call you out for it. And the only way to completely insulate yourself from being called out as a liar is to never develop any firm connections with anybody. But once we bring up the concept of connections in friendship, we immediately uncover another possible abuse of democracy, even at a small scale, one that I'm surprised to hear very few people talking about, and that problem is the problem of factions and factionalism. Say that the three people in our initial example all had completely separate choices as to their favorite place to eat when they were offered a free meal. However, say for instance that two of the three people, in this instance Anna and Lisa, have a strong affinity for each other. They're friends, maybe they even share some sort of in-group that Joe does not. As such, they're inclined to help each other more than they are Joe. Furthermore, because they have this strong affinity, their tastes in food tend to align more, such that Anna likes Lisa's favorite food and Lisa likes Anna's favorite food. It's not their first choice, but it's a close second. Under these circumstances, a discrete abuse presents itself. What if Anna and Lisa were to faction together? Form a combine, if you will, such that Anna and Lisa will collectively vote for each other's favorite food on different days. Thus, one day they vote on Anna's favorite food, the next day they vote on Lisa's favorite food. Each person gets what they want, but at the same time, Joe is completely left out in the cold. Anna and Lisa form a majority. In fact, they form a supermajority. And if the combine holds, Joe might as well not even be participating. He'll never get his favorite food chosen. And since Anna and Lisa have every incentive to help each other out, after all, they are getting their favorite food 50% of the time, when in a free-for-all they probably would only get it 1/3 of the time, we can expect, therefore, that the combine will have no incentive to ever end. Anna and Lisa will rule the roost. They'll be making all of the political decisions, almost as if it were some sort of inverted monarchy. Except this time, instead of the pyramid pointing upwards so that the small part is at the top, this time the pyramid is pointing downwards with a small point at the bottom. People talk a lot about abuses in political power as exclusively stemming from tyrannies, one person exerting their will on the majority. Much less has been said about political abuse stemming from factions, because if we examine this situation, we'll see, I think, that it is much worse for Joe than it would be for any person stuck at the bottom of a pyramid when one person is in charge. As is already obvious from the example cited, Joe will never get his choice of meal. Moreover, whereas when there was only one ruler, the power of the majority was subservient, in this case the power of the majority is ascendant. Anna and Lisa have both numerical superiority and total political power. Unlike a king who might have to fear the wrath of a majority, a ruling combine might never have to fear a rebellion by a minority. That would be futile. Moreover, despite what Anna and Lisa might have thought about Joe when this process began, they may have been more or less indifferent or only liked him marginally less than each other. There will be incentives over time to find reasons to ostracize and think less of Joe. It will be quite clear after some time has elapsed and after many free meals have been decided on that the arrangements are very unfair against Joe. However, being very advantageous to Anna and Lisa, the pair will very likely be casting about for reasons to rationalize their behavior. I mean, certainly there's a reason why Joe never gets to pick the meals. Maybe it's because some of his ancestors did something wrong to one of Anna or Lisa's, or maybe he's just not fit to make the decision. At any rate, some rationalization is needed and will be generated, and it will be all the easier because the majority is making it. For this reason, democracies, even in the simplified form, need to confront the issue of factionalism. It is a distinct danger. And in light of this problem, the only thing that might be able to hold back one of these factions from coming about sooner or later is either a prohibition on discrimination of any kind, e.g. a sort of strict egalitarianism, or otherwise a firm moral code that will keep people's behavior conformed to some general rule that is always followed. If either or both of these things are present, we can say that we have a solution, and with that, our very simplified version of democracy is more or less complete. If it steers clear from factionalism, or lying, or deception, or ignoring people's considered needs, then we have an altogether pretty good system, one that we can, under most circumstances, expect to make better decisions than a monarchy. But we should note here that it was not simply majority rule or egalitarianism that got us here. We needed a few things in place. First, we needed a sort of care-oriented empathy, a desire to take from each according to his ability and give to each according to his need. Following close on that, we also needed an honesty, or a way of checking people and their sincerity when they made claims about that need, something that in most cases could only come from people knowing each other personally when they voted. And lastly, what was needed was a sort of egalitarian ethic that would prevent factioning, a type of non-discrimination rule that would keep people from forming coalitions that would naturally come to politically dominate any type of direct democratic rule. And with these three requirements, we have set out quite a stringent set of rules, even for a simple democratic system that does not have any external constraints on it. Certainly, this would be a tall order for many groups of people, even many groups of friends. But reading through this list, I noticed another quite interesting feature about it, and that was that these values, empathy, non-discrimination, egalitarianism, and honesty, were mainly the core values that progressives were very fond of propounding. In fact, Honesty aside, the other two requirements were the main moral features that oftentimes distinguish progressive thinkers from their conservative or reactionary counterparts: empathy, care, and radical egalitarianism. Immediately, this suggests one possible reason for this: that when progressives or leftists say they believe in democracy, what they in fact believe in is some model that looks like this: a division of an abundant resource with no cost or sacrifice. This is their ideal utopia, their ideal state of humanity, where collective decisions largely focus around dividing up a good, making sure everyone has their fair share and everyone is cared for. And if this is indeed the society that we're talking about, then the progressive left values of egalitarianism and empathy, care are necessary, and really the ones you want to take forward. They're the ones you need for this situation to work. And if this was the end of human political and economic decision-making, then I think it would be fair to say that this would be game over for any right-wing thinkers. But as we might expect, this model is not everything that can be said about economic and political thinking. This model is much too simple. It's radically too simple. In fact, it isn't really even a political or economic model itself. As I said before, economics is the study of scarcity, and without scarcity there really isn't economics. Politics, by contrast, could be seen as the science of studying adversity, and without adversity, you really don't have a political situation. There really isn't a contention for power. So this model doesn't really serve our purposes, even though it provides a good baseline. From here, we can think about scaling things up, adding complexities, and then seeing if what we know about the human race really makes the idea of democracy hold up as a workable system. Or if it does have discrete disadvantages, what those disadvantages are and how they might be overcome. What if we were to take a realistic example, not necessarily scaling up to anything as complicated as a modern nation-state, but simply as a small city-state, say like the Greek city-state of Athens, everyone's go-to example for democracy in the ancient world. Being a realistic human community, this would contain something over 10,000 people. It would have to deal with scarcity, the presence of adversity both inside the community and with it in other rival communities. And it would also have to deal with the increased complexity of people with different skills and organizing society into a productive fashion that could produce things people needed. Not a trivial task. In short, we see the return of real politics, the return of real economics with a vengeance. And in the light of real political questions and real economic questions, the standard fixes for democracy's ills become a lot less simple. The platitudes of empathy, equality, and honesty don't seem nearly sufficient, and in some ways are the exact opposite thing that the society needs. It's not that honesty, equality, and empathy won't work or will be unimportant for human organization. It's just that, at this level, where there are real political and economic concerns, too much of what we know to be true about human nature weighs against any of these qualities actually addressing and fixing the issues we know to be present inside democratic decision-making. We can see the problem starting with empathy and honesty. Now, of course, all of us live in society. We live in large collectives of humans, most of whom in our everyday interaction we don't know. And despite this fact, most of us can remember, if we try, moments that we practiced random acts of empathy and random acts of honesty to complete strangers. There was that time we returned a wallet to the lost and found even though it had a large amount of money in it. There was that time when we played fair and square, even though we could have gotten away with cheating, and congratulated our opponent who we hated after the game, even though we really felt like punching him in the face. We remember these moments of altruistic empathy and honesty, and quite frankly are encouraged to remember these moments of altruistic empathy and honesty by progressives. But when it comes down to humans' ordinary behavior, when it comes down to what we can expect, especially when it comes to a highly competitive society that ordinarily comes about when we're dealing with large, concentrated populations, random acts of altruistic empathy and honesty shouldn't really be expected, at least not as an ordinary occurrence. Human empathy, while prominent in our own minds, is actually a very weak force when it comes down to it. Regardless of what utopians want us to believe, we are a fairly warlike species. And honesty really isn't that much better, not the least of which because humans are so good at self-deception. While it's true that very few people tell bald-faced lies, I imagine that most acts of deception, especially against strangers, begin with a deceiver convincing themselves that their lie is the truth, actually quite a common phenomenon as far as human psychology is concerned. And all of these effects are only exacerbated as you get to larger and larger communities. As we approach Dunbar's number, a number around 200 that represents the maximum number of people that a person can reasonably said to be acquainted with at one given point in time, we will see a precipitous drop in empathy and honesty. It's harder to be empathic and honest to people who are complete strangers, and in larger societies, most people will be complete strangers. And this is only compounded when we mix in cultural and ethnic diversity. As we know from many sociological studies, cultural cohesion is hurt by the introduction of different groups and different social norms, as we might expect. Sure, I'll play a straight game with people of my own group. Sure, I will sympathize with my own kind, but when I'm uncertain of the rules the other guy is playing by, it's a lot harder. How do I know that he's going to reciprocate? All in all, sans some externally imposed order, we can see the general direction that a society like this will largely take. Trust, honesty, and empathy will begin high, but as cheaters and free riders emerge, this will slowly degenerate. The people who are left being honest and empathetic will get taken advantage of, and they in turn will cease their empathy. And when the process is complete, we are likely to have a polity that is not very amenable to a democratic order, at least unless we want to invite the problems we explored in the much simpler model. Although, of course, we could take measures to impose order to make sure that some semblance of honesty and empathy was secured, even inside a very large society. We could erect laws, we could raise an army, we could build roads and walls to keep out foreigners and bandits and other free riders. We could develop norms, customs, and maybe even religions that impose penalties on citizens that were being dishonest or not reciprocating properly. And all of this is very well insofar as it goes to partially confronting our problem with honesty and empathy, but it does cross one of the other requirements we had for democracy. Again, that being egalitarianism, or non-discrimination, an essential property to prevent factionalism. This provides a problem because, much to the chagrin of any anarchists who might be listening to this, to impose order on a large population means to impose hierarchy. Here, I think it's necessary to stop very briefly and discuss a principle that, while popular in reactionary and political science circles, is sadly very under-discussed in mainstream and left-wing discussions about politics and political feasibility. And this principle is what's called the iron law of oligarchy, developed by one German sociologist, Robert Michels, in his 1911 book Political Parties. The iron law of oligarchy states that with any democratic organization, rule by some elite or some oligarchy is inevitable, regardless of how principled or dedicated that initial democratic organization is to egalitarianism and democracy itself. This principle is so simple, yet so often discounted by progressive and liberal thinkers that I'm surprised I don't see it more inside political discussion and debate. After all, if we live in a society, then we need somebody to make the decisions. Naturally, there is a hierarchy of skills. People specialize in terms of labor, production, management, and science. Delegation of tasks is needed, and people are differently able to take responsibility for managing people. Moreover, to compound problems, in real societies there is sacrifice, there is war, there are family relationships. People will make decisions to put the polity before their own well-being, or put their own well-being before the polities. And you can't necessarily deal with that if you're dedicated to strict egalitarianism. You can't really deal with that if you're dedicated to strict non-hierarchy either. How would a military work without orders, without general top-down command no one would fight on the front lines? How would any system of leadership, academic, industrial, or otherwise function if we were to choose leaders by drawing lots and not by competence? And once those leaders are selected, and if they maintain their position, which of course if competencies differ they certainly will not power naturally collect and gravitate upwards? Leaders are needed, hierarchy is needed, and through that hierarchy, power and classes naturally emerge. You can't stop it. But under this guise, how do we even conceptualize our original understanding of democracy? Now, not only do we have a marked decrease in terms of honesty and empathy, we also have a natural tendency for factionalism, for inequity, for backbiting. We have the real possibility that people will use the political system not for collective benefit, but to visit vengeance on each other for iniquities and perceived iniquities they experience in other areas of life. Unless society is perfect, unless society is completely just, e.g. unless society is a utopia, this will always be a problem. Even in a democracy, there has to be a set of rulers, there has to be elites with their eyes on the interests of the body politic and their skins in the game. But how could this even be accomplished? Well, luckily for us, we don't need to speculate because I think the answer is readily available looking at ancient examples of democracy in Athens and Rome. And yes, before anyone goes on, I know that Rome was a republic, but really when we look at the political system of Rome, it really resembled more Athenian democracy than it did anything that we would recognize as a republic, coming out of 19th and 20th century examples. Nevertheless, looking at these ancient sources, I think we do see an idea of what an elitist democracy would look like, and it's nothing really like what progressives would describe as democracy. Here, some core elite of men, usually drawn from landed gentry who also make up the officer corps of the society's military, sit and vote in representation of the rest of society's needs. In Athens, you had the citizens. In Rome, you had the patricians. These were the people that the society considered to be the stakeholders. They owned land and they commanded the armies and military units that defended that land. And among them, they would cast votes. They would elect leaders that would carry out the skill-oriented tasks that needed to be accomplished, be they engineering or war. Something that, in the modern world, we would readily identify more as oligarchy than anything called democracy. Still, for the ancient world, this worked very well, and these systems served their society, at least for a time. The key advantages the system showed was that they really forced the elite class that represented an aristocracy to become invested with the political decision-making being done for the society as a whole. They were, in a sense, voting stakeholders or a board of directors for the civilizations and societies that they represented. Still, as time went on and these societies, Rome and Athens, got richer, the privileges associated with this voting minority became more luxurious and made them more detached from the actual interests of the cities and nations that they represented. As such, the representatives, in time, began to represent less the interests of a society and more the interests of a specific aristocratic class. After time in Rome or in Athens, it became obvious that a monarchy or a dictatorship was necessary, not so much to solidify social order, but to disrupt the entrenched privileges of the elites. And thus, in the classic form of cyclical history, Caesarism or Bonapartism comes to supplant democracy, or anything calling itself democracy where elites rule. But alright, I mean, this again is a digression, right? After all, when most people think of representative democracy, they don't think of an elite that rules in place of the people. They don't think of landowners as stakeholders in their society. They don't see the rich as the guardians that will necessarily vote the interests of the future of the nation. They're thinking more of an Enlightenment conception of a republic or democracy, one where we have consent of the governed, or popular sovereignty, one that represents the will of the people. This is the system we have now, and it works pretty well. Sure, it isn't the direct action that anarchists and communists constantly whine about. Sure, it might not have completely escaped from the iron law of oligarchy. We still have leaders, we still have bureaucrats. There still are class divisions and authority in place, but nevertheless, we more or less make the decisions, at least as it concerns who our lawmakers are. Couldn't this be considered a democracy? Couldn't this be considered as evidence that democracy works? And sure enough, it is evidence that democracy works. Our own democratic republic is a form of democracy, and I wouldn't let anyone tell me that our society doesn't work at all. People who say that tend to not have a very good grasp of what constituted working, historically speaking. At any rate, by any reasonable measure, our society is a success. So does that mean that we have a winner in democracy? Well, perhaps, but while I think it's very obvious that our society works, at least to a certain extent, it might not work for the reasons we think it works, or at least the reasons we are told that it works in school. The Founding Fathers who designed the American system, and therefore implicitly a lot of elements of other more modern parliamentary and democratic systems, were solidly aware of the disadvantages and pitfalls of democracy and voting. They talked about them all the time, but they also at the same time surrounded themselves with a good amount of Enlightenment bullshit. Terms like liberty and equality and representation were bandied about, and regardless of whether the Founding Fathers were firmly enthralled by these Enlightenment buzzwords, they nonetheless found them as useful propaganda in their forging of a new political system for America, and thus, in coming centuries, most of the Western world. And so what are some of these common explanations that we hear both from the Founding Fathers and perhaps to a much more exaggerated and illiterate sense from people who teach primary schools? Although I'm sure your mileage will likely vary depending on your upbringing. I'm familiar with 3 pretty standard explanations for why democracy is a good thing, and why every people has the right to a democratic government. The first most grandiose and easiest to debunk reason for democracy is the classic will of the people. This is something that varies a lot between the two political sides, with progressives relying on the will of the people quite a bit in their own propaganda, and conservatives being somewhat skeptical of the formulation. In short, it implies that there is some monolithic will that can be democratically discovered. There is sort of a wisdom of crowds, or some intuitive knowledge we have at a collective level. The democratic process, therefore, is merely an empirical way of discovering what this will is. As always with these formulations, it's really hard to determine what exactly is supposed to be taken seriously and what is simply propaganda that no one was ever supposed to believe. But if we take this at face value, it is manifestly ridiculous. There is no such collective consciousness or will. Even if we talk about collectives and cultural groups that have morality in common and that could be said to have a common interest, there's no reason to expect that this interest will be manifest by the masses themselves, let alone that this will manifest in some kind of will or voice that can be expressed through the democratic process. Moreover, this will of the people terminology seems to lend itself to any Caesar or Bonaparte who wants to be a dictator in the name of the people. Since it's a borderline religious concept itself, one might imagine that a particularly capable individual is more attuned to hearing this will than the democratic process of voting itself. More popular among conservatives, but somewhat equally easy to debunk, is the concept of consent of the governed, a Madisonian and Enlightenment concept that arises out of the early 19th century. This is the period of popular determination and popular sovereignty, at least in North America. Now, while less religious and less grandiose in nature, and of course more oriented towards a republican form of government, popular sovereignty and consent of the governed, as principles, also have a number of problems. Now, unlike the will of the people, it is very easy to imagine consent of the governed taking place. Regardless of whether the people have a will or not, we can always imagine them voting the bastards out at the ballot box. In fact, it's happened many times in history. However, if we scratch the surface a bit, we'll notice that this popular sovereignty and consent of the governed is much less free and uncontrolled than we might initially imagine. After all, the will of the people doesn't arise out of the ether. It doesn't arise out of any kind of collective spirit, as we've already established in the previous section. Where then does the popular consensus come from? Well, alluding to Mencius Molebug and also to my fellow YouTuber Endeavor, who's made a similar video about just this subject a few weeks ago, the popular will is more or less manufactured by elites who run educational institutions and media organizations. It exists inside certain boundaries set up by the political and cultural institutions of that age, aka the Overton window. The idea of consent of the governed doesn't even constrain politicians as much as we would hope, because consent of the governed in popular sovereignty can be manufactured by specific actions that politicians and leaders take. Elections can be swung by scandal and panic, by media sensation and get-out-the-vote campaigns, by gerrymandering. Moreover, not to skirt too controversial a topic, but in the long term, politics can also be swung by demographic change. Now again, I don't want to get into the modern controversies of demographics in the modern Western countries, but since we're dealing with a thoroughly 19th century subject, popular sovereignty, we might return to one of the foundational events in the decline of popular sovereignty as a political concept in the 19th century, namely the battle in bloody Kansas. For those not familiar with American history, popular sovereignty was designated for a time as the de facto way of deciding whether new states in the Union would be slave or free. And between 1954 and 1959, the proposed state of Kansas was going to come up for a vote over whether it would be a slave or free state. However, to influence the overall democratic power that would be wielded at the national level, hordes of activists from both the pro-slavery and anti-slavery side came pouring into Kansas with the hope of demographically influencing the state's vote on one side or the other. As the confrontations between the two sides became contentious, Kansas began playing out a bloody civil war, a full 5 or 6 years before the actual American Civil War would take place. Thus, in this one example, we see magnified the chief problem with just deferring to popular sovereignty or consent of the governed. There is no unity, and in a situation where there is no cultural consensus, both sides are encouraged to use demographic and warlike tools against one another in order to come out the final victor in terms of body count. To say the least, this is quite a suboptimal state of affairs. Okay, well, with those two reasons down, what do we have left? Well, the one defense of democracy we have left, and the most compelling in my own eyes, is simply a quote that I've heard attributed to Winston Churchill, although given its sardonic and self-deprecating nature, I feel like it must have earlier origins, probably either in Mark Twain or earlier in Benjamin Franklin. And the quote is this: "Democracy is the worst system, except for all of the others." And in a nutshell, I think this does present a very conservative defense of the concept of democracy, if not a recommendation of how it works in the ideal. We might not believe in the will of the people, popular sovereignty, or consent of the governed. We might understand that this is all Enlightenment bullshit propaganda, yet at the time being, do we have any better way to organize and run large countries with a diversity of different peoples living inside of them? If there does exist such a system, we don't know of it yet. Although, I have a feeling that China and Russia are going to be experimenting in this capacity in the next 50 years. Nevertheless, if this is the final defense of democracy, if the reason for believing in democracy is simply that we don't have a better system, and we fully acknowledge it has all of the problems we have previously described, and no real practical solution for them, one might ask why our own system works so well. Why does it seemingly have so few problems? Or should I say, why did it at one point have so few problems, and why are problems beginning to emerge right now? For a moment, I want to return to my ideal of the model. What if we took a very dispassionate look about how Republican democracy actually works, and ask ourselves what kind of decisions and abuses might arise from it, at a very abstract level? If we applied what we know about human nature, would we be able to find disadvantages and drawbacks of this system? Ways that it works and doesn't work, when brought into focus with what we already know about human nature and human limitations? Well, perhaps. Our own system of democratic republicanism works in a vague sort of way. where we take a group of people, usually geographically arranged, and have them elect representatives to vote in turn in a central democratic system. In this way, the electoral process sort of generates an instant aristocracy that can be used as guardians of the society to filter democratic will and form it into the production of laws and order that are needed to govern a large multifaceted society like our own. But how do these elected representatives actually make their decision? And how do we know that they're making those decisions effectively? What incentivizes them? If we've discarded the notions of the popular will and consent of the governed, what at the end of the day constrains their actions and directs their decision-making process? Well, unless we want to believe that all of these people sitting in Congress and the House of Representatives are the perfect empathic altruists, which we should never assume inside any reasonable construction of society, then we must, by process of elimination, believe that these politicians are motivated by self-interest. In particular, it's a good bet that these politicians are motivated by self-interest to get re-elected. And if that's too entirely cynical, we might imagine that politicians have some notion of collective responsibility, but still that this notion of collective responsibility is vague in its inception. The politician might want to do well for the American people, which is to say, do well for one group of the American people, which oftentimes means doing not so well for another group of American people. The politician, in other words, has a vague sense of duty, although not particularly well directed. So with that being said, what actually does a politician decide on when he's choosing whether to vote up or vote down a potential piece of legislation? Human beings, when they make up and down decisions, are fairly simple in their arrangements. They usually only can consider a handful of different reasons, a handful of different influences that might suggest one thing or the other. Think of any time you ever made a major decision. Usually you cook up a list of reasons that you should or shouldn't do the thing in question, and then come up with a short list, a good 5 or so things that you're going to seriously consider as reasons for one course or the other. And the same is true for politicians. They're going to have their handful of reasons, or handful of interest groups that are going to lead them in one direction or the other. If a politician is thinking rationally and with self-interest, he'll likely think of all of the different interest groups that might influence his re-election. Those who might fund him, or worst yet, fund his opponent in a re-election or primary campaign. Moreover, he will think of the chief constituents that got him elected, or that might swing in group against him when another election came up. Moreover, if we consider that the politician might be voting in an altruistic or empathetic way, still, yet again, he'll try to think of which groups he needs to serve, which need the most charity, which are closest to him politically, culturally, empathetically. Are the interest groups that really need attention African Americans, or farmers, or taxpayers? Are they red staters or blue staters? Note here that it's really impossible for the politician to consider the polity as a whole, especially if that polity is incredibly diverse. They don't have the same interests, usually, and they certainly don't vote as one undifferentiated bloc. Therefore, inside a politician's decision-making process, we will find different groups and different interests competing for power, contesting for real estate inside the decision-maker's mind when he's casting the ballot. Thus, if we were to put democracy under a microscope, if we were to crack open the decision-making process of a legislative or executive body, no matter how large, we would find some similar thought process involved. A psychological war for interest, either in the politician's mind as a danger for re-election, or in the politician's mind as an interest group that needs special attention because he has a special obligation to them, be that obligation born out of need or out of merit of the population in question. If this is an accurate depiction of how actual Republican Democratic politics is run, then this provides a very, very different picture of how actual power is divvied up in between groups inside a democratic republic. And this picture does not conform itself to the propaganda we learned about democracy in grade school. How do I get my voice heard inside a Republican democracy like our own? Well, long story short, join an interest group. Join a lobbying group. As an individual, you may vote for candidate X or candidate Y, But if politician X or politician Y get into office and they can't recognize you, they can't recognize your concern as part of a large interest group that is particularly noteworthy either by its need to be served or by its power or influence over you when it comes time for re-election, neither of those two candidates are going to feel particularly beholden to your vote, to your general perspective on politics. It's much, much too small. Under this model, everyone is competing for psychological real estate inside the minds of our leaders. If you're a member of an interest group, your chief object is to make that interest group seemingly more important to politicians who are voting on issues of spending and of power delegation. If you're not part of an interest group currently being recognized by people in power, your goal is to get your interest group into the minds of politicians. You need to be recognized, not individually, but collectively, because it is only in aggregation that representatives can ever conceptualize their interest groups, even if they're trying to be entirely altruistic or empathetic in their decision-making process. Under this conception, the great irony is this: Republican democracy isn't about individualism, it is about identity politics. That's the only intelligent way to play the game. That's the only way the game has ever been played. It is, in fact, a collective sport. It can only be won by groups. And even though the neoconservatives and classic Buckleyite conservatives might shirk at this suggestion, it really is true. I mean, I challenge them to find a way around the logic of this model when everything is down. Even the founding fathers who wrote the Constitution, who conceptualized our notion of federal governments with checks and balances, were counting on a type of identity politics. We're counting on some form of collectivity being evident inside decision-making processes. However, coming from an 18th century context where mass transportation and instant telecommunications were not yet invented, it occurred to them that all of this collective interest would largely be focused around geographics. Regionalism and state loyalties would play a dominant role inside the government. Thus, our current federal government, in America at least, is organized around a federalist concept, aimed to divide power up among regional areas, complementing a majoritarian concern in the House with an equalist distribution of power among regions in the Senate. Not a bad decision at all if you were to assume that the main collective groups vying for control over the power structures would naturally be geographic in origin. In the 20th century, however, this assumption has been thoroughly tested and broken, and all we have to fall back on are the mythologies of democracy, the Enlightenment propaganda that I think everyone at this point knows is complete bullshit. And this is a problem because it means the mythology and the justification we have behind our present system really is totally disconnected from how it actually works, how the Founding Fathers imagined it would work. It's fair to say that the Founding Fathers didn't imagine there would be ethnic, cultural, and sexuality-oriented interest groups. Moreover, to compound the problem, the Founders also expected there would be some limitation to government reach, that there would be some area of the economy that would be permanently out of the reach of the government to control and confiscate. This being no longer true, there is nothing stopping individual interest groups from raiding the public coffers, robbing the collective to enrich their own interests. But if this is the new reality of democratic republics, if this is what we have eventually come to, then the real fools are not the Founding Fathers who could not see our current state of affairs from 250 years ago, but rather the people in the present age who don't get on board with playing identity politics and group lobbying for government interest. And that gets us down to the question of how do we properly game this conception of democratic republicanism? How do we use it to achieve the most? How do we effectively play the game? By voting? By lobbying? By simply trying to ignore the process itself? A tough question, certainly, but I'll try to answer it here. There is a problem when we think about the act of voting, and that is not that it is completely impotent. It is power, but it is a very, very small amount of power. So small, in fact, that humans have a very hard time conceptualizing it. Thus, we are constantly caught in between the dilemma of ignoring power that we do have and convincing ourselves that we have more power than we actually possess. Both being dangerous propositions, it's a tricky business going forward. Despite the difficulty, we can outline some general rules. Starting from this. Rule 1. Metapolitics and metapolitical limitations are king. If democratic republicanism is a game, then metapolitics and the rules that make up our metapolitical preconceptions are both the field, the sporting equipment, and also the rulebook. Without them, there really is no process or game itself. Without constraints on power, anyone who swings power one way for one moment could simply end the game by declaring the new rules to be one man, one vote, one time. Similarly, cultural preconceptions about what is acceptable or unacceptable can be used to rule things out prima facie before they even go up to a vote. For instance, open immigration policy and affirmative action have never been popular among the majority of Americans, yet they never get abolished even though politicians speak out against them quite a bit. And this is because the reigning orthodoxy among the leadership class accepts these as a default assumption that they will carry on going forward into the future. This assumption among the ruling class has made more difference than 3 generations of Republican politicians claiming to be against these things. If you are a person who has deep issues with the direction that your society is going, if you have some deep underlying gripe about the culture, you're not likely going to be able to find the solution to it inside politics, properly conceptualized inside democratic republicanism. That's a futile game. Sure, individual votes, individual power swings will matter, but your overarching project inside politics has to take something of a more fundamental turn. In other words, you can't just elect the right guy. Rule 2. Inside the game, organization and perceived group interest is everything. Now, I think in between discussions about metapolitics, culture, and things that go over politicians' heads, and discussions about identity politics, micropolitics, and elections, oftentimes our discussion about general societal organization and perceived identity go out the window. Still, this is one of the most important things inside a democratic system, inside a cultural system. What groups do you perceive yourself belonging to? What groups do you perceive to have your interests at heart? Even groups that don't necessarily vote as a collective. That matters. That has influence over the long term, and will matter more than any momentary identity politic push at a one-time election level. For instance, interest groups and lobbying aside, I think many politicians who were trying to do the right thing had a much easier time conceptualizing how to serve the American people in 1950 than they would in 2020. That's because there is a clear idea of what the American people were in 1950 and there was in 2020, at a cultural level. In short, a congressman in 1950 had a very good idea of what America and American interest looked like, what the average American looked like, what the average American family that was expected to continue on and on into the future looked like. And because of that, there was an understanding of what those interests were. Now, to a large degree, this wasn't some mystical will of the people. This was a specific thing manufactured at the metapolitical level, a mythology we all shared in about what an American was, what the ideal American was, and what the ideal American family was. To give the devil his due, this was very much what the progressives say it was. It was the presumption that the American family was middle class, white, straight, and European in ethnic origin. The assumed culture of America was Western, and there was a sense that this was what it should be going forward into the future, an essential element of any political decision-making process at a collective level. In 2019, it's not even so much that politicians aren't altruistic, but that the entire idea of being altruistic towards a unified concept of an American people is kind of dicey to begin with. Which American people? It's harder even than it was in 1860, right before the Civil War, because as opposed to imagining Virginians versus New Yorkers, we're having a myriad of different crisscrossing identities that have non-cohesive boundaries. And this is something much deeper than just one identity group versus the other. It's how society is organized at a very, very deep identitarian level. And reactionaries make a mistake about this all the time, probably misunderstanding one of their core concepts. I think we can see this most clearly in the very common reactionary complaint about women's suffrage. Oftentimes, women's suffrage, women voting, is treated rather flippantly as an origin point for a lot of our political problems in the early 21st century. Quite frankly, while I see what they're getting at least in a joking manner, I think they're barking up the wrong tree or don't quite understand the core force of the reactionary critique of democracy. Women's suffrage in the West was accomplished very, very early in the 20th century, with the 19th Amendment in America being passed in 1920. Of course, there were worries about the family destabilizing and the entire politics of America changing quite promptly, but prohibition possibly notwithstanding, no such insanity broke out after women's suffrage. America kept on being America after women got the vote en masse. Why was this? Well, it was because in 1920, most women were married to men, or would be married to men very shortly. As such, their votes typically conformed around the interests of being members of a family. The family was the chief economic unit, and therefore, to advance their own fortunes, they necessarily had to advance the fortunes of their children and husbands. They naturally wanted to advance the fortunes of their children and husbands wanted to advance the interests of their wives. Therefore, just as before suffrage, the main voting unit in society was families. However, this time, with the vote of the father representing the entire family, it was more or less surrogated for 2 votes coming from each of the adult members of that family. Overall, and on balance, there was no change. It wasn't until the emergence of no-fault divorce and the decline of the nuclear family in the 1960s that we really saw the emergence of gendered politics on the national stage, and a situation that we have now where men and women are seen as 2 separate and opposed voting blocs with different interests contesting in a general election against each other. To take a rather absurd thought experiment, even in our own fragmented and contentious time where men and women seem like enemies to each other, if all men and women paired up in equal love matches, and then we told them politically that they could only cast 1 vote between them, that come election time, only couples who agreed on their political choices could cast a ballot together, one representing both of them, immediately gendered politics would completely disappear. Each of the pairs would realize that they only had power voting together, and naturally over time their interests would align. Note, if you would, that we've done really nothing to influence the actual mechanics of voting. There are roughly equal men and women, and if we were to pair them up 1-to-1, a man voting against a woman would naturally cancel each other's votes out. Yet once each of the 2 sides realizes that they are voting together, the entire dynamics of the democratic system completely change. And that is the power of organization. That is the power of cultural conception over groups. And this brings me to Rule 3. After groups are formed, after our cultural organization is determined, identity politics will rule the roost. This is a bitter pill for conservatives to swallow, but there is no way getting around identity politics, leaving aside platitudes that I'm rather fond of saying that all politics are identity politics. In a democratic republican system like our own, identity politics are the name of the game. Regardless of the millions of people who voted for the politicians that currently vote in the Senate and in Congress, these politicians are humans, and as such they only have a finite number of interest groups that they can conceptualize when choosing whether to vote up or down on a given bill. Given that we live in a diverse nation with no unified demographic or cultural order, naturally this is going to involve choosing one group's interests over the other. That means, naturally, identity politics are going to break out, and they're not going to be the regional identity politics that were originally conceptualized by the Founding Fathers. We said goodbye to that in the 19th century with the advent of the telegraph. I know most Western countries are coming down from the myth that identity politics doesn't matter or shouldn't matter or couldn't matter in a modern industrial society. But take it 10 or 50 or 60 years, this myth will eventually die because a myth it is. And then will come the necessary work of doing actual, real politics, which will start at the lowest level with group politics. As mentioned before, demographics play a key role in all of this. If unified with a common identity, the European populations of North America and of Europe could probably seize control of their countries and forestall and perhaps even reverse their own demographic decline. However, given an absence of such an identity, this is almost certainly not going to happen. But as we enter a new era in the West as reactionaries, as people pushing back against Enlightenment myths, we have to be aware of this, even if we realize the futility of some projects of preservation. Every group, when formed and politically organized, is going to be a necessary decrease in power of the other political groups operating in a country. It must necessarily be so. The more groups operating, the harder it is to divide up power. The more organized those interest groups are, the more they will wield power as interest groups at the highest level. For this reason, modern progressive notions of giving prisoners the right to organize and vote en masse is either entirely cynical or truly stupid. Prisoners being given the right to vote are either going to organize politically as an interest group, in which case they will necessarily decrease the relative political power of all non-imprisoned people and create an interest group for felons, or they will vote as singletons and ultimately make no difference on the political process overall. Every demographic exchange is part of the democratic process, and one that's much more fundamental to playing the game than anything you can do at the ballot box. This is one reason why historically, at least before 1965, countries were very, very careful about how they played with demographic numbers. Once the cat's out of the bag, the cat's out of the bag on this, and I would say that the feline has thoroughly fled at this point. But after that, I'm not so sure what there is left. We can vote certainly, we can wield our microscopic amount of power, but with these three rules in place, I think we will see that it really is a tertiary consideration. That is, tertiary at best. Any democratic system is about organization and identity, and although we might consider that cynical and unromantic and a betrayal of the ideas that produce this nation, it's the reality we need to contend with if we care about the good of our families going forward into the future, if we care about the good of our peoples and our faiths going forward into the future. This is the only responsible approach to politics, the real one. But when I say this, I hear an implicit objection coming from the corner of my mind. Wait, it says, have we not totally misunderstood the whole point of democracy? Have we not mischaracterized its goals, its intents, what it was trying to do? Silly progressive platitudes aside, certainly democracy is less a system. It's less a way of managing political power and the division of order inside a complex multi-level polity. It's more of an ideal. It's more of a virtue. Even if it's impossible, it's something that humanity needs to strive towards. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't like this idea. I didn't want to have some concept of democracy carried forward as an ideal, if not a practical political purpose. Would it not be cynical to discard what Washington and Jefferson fought for and persist in playing petty political games, even if we know that's more realistic? But before I make this concession, I would like to ask one question. What do we mean by democracy? I mean, of course, in its ideal form, in its principled form. As we said at the beginning of this video, we can quite clearly define democracy, the form of government, democracy, the practical political principle, as simply a mechanism of choice, voting, and a form of government that is distributed among multiple shareholders that all cast a vote and decide on a course of action. But if we leave aside the practical definition of democracy as a system we started with and treat it instead as an ideal, and we are committed to democracy as an ideal, what does democracy as an ideal mean? What is it that inspires us? What is it about democracy that convinces us that it is truly virtuous to begin with? It certainly can't be the principle that we are all equal. Poetic language from Thomas Jefferson aside, that's just untrue. And a flat-out lie can't be a virtue, can it? Moreover, I also don't think that the ideal of democracy really can be just the physical act of voting. The mechanics of casting a ballot and distributed leadership in general. I mean, to me, that sounds more just a tool to accomplish an end, not really an ideal in itself. And so the mystery of democracy as an ideal persists. But if I could be indulged as we approach the end of this video, I would like to explore this more by examining the opinions of one G.K. Chesterton, who is a famous defender of democracy, much less skeptical of the concept than I am. Still, when explaining his affinity for what democracy actually was as an ideal, he gave a very interesting answer, provided a definition that was starkly in contrast with the pure mechanisms of democracy, the mechanisms of voting. On democracy, G.K. Chesterton wrote this: "This is the first principle of democracy, that the essential things in men are the things that they hold in common, not the things that they hold separately. And the second principle is merely this, that the political instinct or desire is one of these things, which they hold in common. Falling in love is more poetic than dropping into poetry. The democratic contention is that government, helping to rule the tribe, is a thing like falling in love, and not a thing like dropping into poetry. It is not something analogous to playing the church organ, painting on vellum, discovering the North Pole, looping the loop, being astronomer royal, or so on. For these things we do not wish that a man to do at all unless he does them well. It is, on the contrary, a thing analogous to writing one's own love letters, or blowing one's own nose. These things we want a man to do for himself, even if he does them badly. I am not here arguing the truth of any of these conceptions. I know some moderns are asking to have their wives chosen by scientists, and they may be soon asking, for all I know, to have their noses blown by nurses. I merely say that mankind does recognize these universal human functions, and that democracy classes government among them. In short, the democratic faith is this, that the most terribly important things must be left to ordinary men themselves. The mating of the sexes, the rearing of the young, the laws of the state. This is democracy, and in this I have always believed." True enough, and in G.K. Chesterton's democracy, there is poetry, though I think it resembles very little of what progressives imagine as democracy. And in this way, I always get the sense that Chesterton's democracy was a confusion of political language, something that, while beautiful, generated more confusion than it did light. We may recognize democracy not as the ascent of some universal human spirit, but instead as the simple necessity to have humanity be something that is performed locally, that is shared in between people commonly. That although there are some rulers that have their skin in the game and the interests of the polity in mind, at the end of the day, human existence belongs to us all. We all have our skin in the game. We all have interests in what occurs. And we all are invested in the next generation. This is an expansive definition of democracy, and quite a daunting one, and something that I myself feel more comfortable calling subsidiarity, because in it does not just lie rights, but more importantly than that, responsibility, obligation, and duty, not just to the many interest groups, to the voting blocs that currently wield power in one government or the other, but also to the vast expanse of humanity that exists both living, dead, and yet to be born.